Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So simple.
Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for June 19th, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation we're about to have on Pixar. And who doesn't love a good Pixar film, Brendan?
I don't know. We almost decided to talk about this, Pixar specifically, as the main show topic this weekend. And we decided to veto that because we thought there might be some negative feelings towards certain films. So I do think there are some negative feelings some people have to Pixar, especially as of late, given their formula.
Yeah.
So I would say to those people, they're out of their element. So
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting because, Guillermo del Toro, during this last year's awards campaign, everywhere he went, he kept talking about how animation is cinema. And I think that is something that we as cinephiles certainly agree with. However, and I was thinking about this earlier today, not only because of the discourse around Elemental, but when you look back at our Disney conversations that we've had here the last few months or so.
Animation breeds passion. You notice
and that's it. Like, now I can't speak for, let's say, Gen Xers or any of the previous generations before that, but with millennials and the younger generations, and maybe it's because we grew up with the Disney Renaissance era, which was supremo animation, right?
Yes, absolutely.
That we have really come to love animation, and we do consider it to be cinema. It's not just these silly cartoons for children. It is true cinema, and I think as a result, at least with the millennials and the younger generations that have begun to follow, I think it is breeding a passion for those films that might not have exist with the older generations.
Yeah.
And so when you bring them up, whether it be Disney or Pixar or now with Sony, Illumination, whatever it may be, we're pretty passionate about these movies.
They are.
We'll defend them, at all costs. And sometimes that leads to some heated disagreement at times.
Well, it's not even just the Disney Renaissance era, like we talked about on the main show, I think a few weeks ago. I can't forget the exact date and exact number as we're recording this right now, but we obviously grew up with that era. So we're very passionate about the films that came out in the early to mid 90s. But then you mentioned a name like Pixar, which has been kind of dubbed the premier animation studio as far as computer animation is concerned. But you look at their run of films in the 2000s specifically. I mean, minus Cars. Most people would probably say you don't have to worry about Cars. But think of like movies like Finding Nemo all the way through to Toy Story 3. You were basically dealing with many movies that people would dub as masterpieces. So, so holding animation in general in such high regard, especially for those of us at our age who were growing up at that time and saw those films as kind of formative for us. I mean, it makes sense why we would hold animation
exactly. And that's a really great point, because recently we talked about the Renaissance era, and that was significant for animation at the time. But you are right that Pixar entering the world of cinema it completely reshaped animation for the next few decades. And you know what? Let's run through this a little bit, because honestly, it will affect my thoughts on Elemental as we get into that.
Interesting.
And we all know this, but let's just put it out there for context as we get into this conversation, right? So through the mid 90s and the 2000s, the run was Toy Story, obviously, the original
classic. It's a
classic. A Bug's Life, maybe not as great, but overall still good, I would say.
It's a nice version of a nice animated version rather of Seven Samurai. Yeah, it's good.
But then we get into this just insane run. Toy Story 2, Monsters Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Okay, then there's Cars, which might be lesser of that.
I still
crop.
think Cars is kind of
It's
fun.
still
That
good.
first Cars
the
is not
first
bad.
one's still good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then Ratatouille, Wall-E, Up, Toy Story 3. My goodness. So that's a hell of a run. Even with Cars there thrown in the middle, that is a hell of a run.
Sometimes I think we're harder on Pixar because they had a run that is so unfair. It's so unfair.
Most studios never have that type of
No,
run.
they could have retired.
Yeah. Truly incredible. And then you get into the 2010s and it's a little bit more even, I think it's fair to say, with Cars 2, then Brave, Monsters University. Not great, those 3. Then you get to Inside Out. I will argue is maybe Pixar's best overall movie.
It's
top
such an
tier at the very
outlier.
least.
It's such an outlier. It might at least be top 5. I know you like it a little bit more than I do, but it does feel like such an outlier of the 2010s output with because it feels more in line with that amazing run in the 2000s. It feels like it could have come from that.
I
era.
agree. No, it very much feels like it should belong in that 95 to 2010 crop of Pixar films. It's
Replace
elite.
it with
top
Cars,
10.
and you've got the perfect lineup.
I agree. That same year, 2015, is The Good Dinosaur, which is directed by Peter Sohn, who directed Elemental, which we're about to get into.
Yeah.
Following that, Finding Dory, not great. Cars 3,
it's not.
I know you hate it.
Cars 3 is the worst animated movie ever made.
I won't go that far, but I don't think it's great necessarily.
Oh, yeah.
Then there's Coco, Incredibles 2, Toy Story 4, and then we get to the 2020s with Onward, Soul, Luca, which you and I both love, Turning Red, and then last year's Lightyear, which is one of their worst efforts, I think.
I'm not a fan of Lightyear either.
And then here we are with Elemental. So from 2011 through now, so everything post Toy Story 3, it's been a little volatile. I think that's fair to say.
A lot of bumps.
little uneven.
A lot of bumps. It's kind of out of its element.
So some good, some great, even a lot of not so good.
Yeah. Watching that whole trajectory or watching all those films, it started to turn me into every emotion from Inside Out because it just gave me bipolar disorder at times. Because for every Inside Out and every Luca, then there'd be a Lightyear to completely negate that, and it just completely created this uneven trajectory that they're on.
Yeah,
and then
and
we obviously talk. We'll talk about this as well, I'm sure. But then the whole release strategy that Disney has been pushing on Pixar with regard to their original films, as opposed to their more IP related films, what gets on Disney Plus, what gets on theaters. That's even made it more unfortunate when we would have loved to see movies like Luca on the big screen and hear that amazing score.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Their release strategy of late, and I understand some of this is tethered to the pandemic and trying to get audiences onto Disney Plus. Disney finds value in that. And we can certainly get into that maybe at the end of this conversation or another time, because I do think that is a separate conversation when we're talking about the box office, whether that be with Pixar. There's been a lot of this relating to The Flash and DC and really just superhero movies at large.
Yeah.
There's a conversation to be had about that. Perhaps we can get into that here in the next week or so.
Sure.
However, with all of that laid out on the table, let's go ahead and transition to Elemental, which is the latest film from Pixar, as I noted, directed by Peter Sohn and stars Mamadou Ache, Leo Lewis, Ronnie Del Carmen, and many other voices that come and go throughout the film. So what do you think is the best way to lay out the premise here? So all of this takes place in Elemental City, which is this world where we have fire people, there's water people, air, earth, I believe.
Yeah.
So you have all of these residents living together that are certainly representative of diversity, and we'll certainly get into the allegory and what all of it means.
Yeah, you might as well call this city Metaphor City, I think is what we can.
Metaphor City? Yes, that's pretty much what it is.
It's what it is. It's the whole movie's one giant walking metaphor.
Yeah, and look, to be fair to the film, it's not it's not trying to hide that. It is
No.
it is very open about
Turning
its
red
metaphors.
was a very direct metaphor for growing
Yeah.
pains from a female perspective, and that movie rocks, if you ask me. So a movie can be a walking metaphor like that and still work like that. We're not saying that is a
Yes.
bad thing. It is what it is.
It is what it is. I do think perhaps because it's Pixar and this is a movie that is, aiming to entertain the parents, adults, and children simultaneously. So for it to be a little bit more transparent in that regard, I certainly don't.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
But you're certainly right about that, regardless. And then, we have these two characters. We have Ember, who is one of the fire residents, and then we have Wade, one of the water residents. They come together and they form a friendship. And I guess we can get into what all of that means. So, Brendan, what did you think of Pixar's latest, An Elemental?
And you mentioned director Peter Sohn there. I've heard some people saying that this is, in many ways, his directorial debut, even though he did direct The Good Dinosaur, but he more so inherited The Good Dinosaur.
Yeah, that was a production issue film.
Yeah. And to be fair, I don't think The Good Dinosaur is very good, no pun intended. But there are moments that are great. So
I agree.
when we reviewed that movie some years ago, we acknowledged and gave credit to Peter Sohn for at least attempting to fix a broken product and was able to do the best he could with it. The fact that there were some decent moments in that movie, I think, is a sign that he is that he could potentially be a good filmmaker.
Yeah.
So to see his 100% vision represented in a film like this is exciting, especially since it is very personal for him. He has talked about that this is very much inspired by his upbringing as an immigrant coming here from Korea, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And that is why the movie's metaphorical leanings are so literal like that.
Yeah.
And I don't mind that. Like movies like Luca and Turning Red, which I think spiritually Elemental is most similar to. These movies are a bit direct, but they have emotional nuances, especially in their character relationships, that I think make them very earnest and sincere. And Elemental, for those reasons, is a movie I should love. And I will say I love movies like Luca and Turning Red because they're kind of simple. They're introspective, but they're also kind of hangouty. They're not really driven by the clever world building that Pixar is kind of known for, to make you kind of point and go, oh, I get what they're doing there. I get that little trick that they're doing there. Elemental is not really doing that, much like Luca and Turning Red were not doing that. And I really like the movie for that. And I will say I do like this movie, but there is something kind of holding it back for me emotionally, and I'm not really sure what it is. We might talk about this as we go, and maybe I'll be able to uncover what it actually. As I think about it, I think I know what it is. I love so much of Ember's backstory, and I love Leia Lewis's vocal performance as Ember, and I especially love the dynamic that she has with her father, Bernie, I think his name is, who is voiced by Ronnie Del Carmen, who's also known as a co-director for other Pixar efforts. So I like that we're not relying on a very well-known voice cast, which is something Pixar used to do a lot. And I think it allows the film to focus more on what story it's telling and what it's trying to make us think about and feel. So I love those components. I'll say this because I think this is the reason why I don't love this movie. And I think you're higher on the movie than I am, JD. So I want you to have the floor to talk about why that is.
Okay.
I did not really care for Achi's performance as Wade Ripple. And I think that's really the big thing. And I don't want to be like too negative on like what his capabilities are as an actor, because we've seen him before and I thought he was charming in some of the other roles that I've seen him in. But to be honest, I kind of found the Wade character a little bit obnoxious. And I realize he's kind of supposed to be, but there's a screechiness to it that sort of created this roadblock between his character and Ember and what relationship they were supposed to have. So something just didn't work for me in the romantic side of this story. I want to see a great romance like this from Pixar, and I think this could have been the movie. And if you're on board with those two characters and their dynamic, this movie is probably going to work for you. And to be fair, if I didn't have that one reservation, I would probably say this is maybe like top 15 Pixar or something like that. At least I might be leaning like a 4 out of 5 on Letterbox, at least getting close to that. But
Mhm.
to me, it's kind of more in that second to third tier. Like of the 27 films from Pixar, I think I'd rank this right now spontaneously, maybe around 18 or 19. So
Okay.
I do think it's good. I think it's earnest, especially in the familial side. But from a romantic side, I was left at a slight arm's length. There's something about his vocal performance that just didn't quite work for me. And that's
Okay.
unfortunate. So JD, have the floor. Tell me why this movie's way better than I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I did really like this film, and I'll certainly get into some reasons why, but some of it simply comes down to the context that we laid out before. Because when I
Yeah.
look at this film on the whole, comparatively to, and you know how I am with comparison, I don't always love it, but
Yeah.
in this instance, it does very much help articulate why I'm higher on it than
Hmm.
you and perhaps many others out there that have found this to be mediocre Pixar. But when you compare this to Cars 2 and 3, Brave, The Good Dinosaur, Finding Dory, Lightyear, this is, pun
It's better
intended,
than those. It is
light
better
years
than those.
better than
but
those
it's
movies.
better than because it's at least a movie. It's telling
Yeah.
a story from a complete story from beginning to end very seamlessly.
Yeah. I mean, this is not Inside Out good. It's not Luca good. Like, this is solidly in that second tier for me, but
Yeah.
it is good. I do think this film has a lot to offer. As you talked about, it has a lot of heart. It has great sincerity to it. Allegorically, it's working as this immigrant tale. It's this blistering romance. And for me, all of that comes together seamlessly.
Okay.
The allegory itself, I think, is very moving with Ember and the relationship she has with her father, and even a little bit that we see with her mother, especially toward the end. And that's what makes Pixar who they are. When you consider not just the themes of their movies, but how they function emotionally. And I think with Ember and how she wrestles with where she comes from and how that intersects with taking over her father's store, which is
Yeah.
something that is, established at the beginning of the film when she's just a little kid and
Mhm.
growing into her identity as an adult. How all of that comes together, I think, is really affecting on an emotional, from an emotional perspective.
Sure.
And as her identity begins to evolve when she encounters Wade and this romance begins to blossom, I think there's additional texture there that makes this film all the more compelling. And I do
Okay.
love how the film not only involves these interesting complexities, but it utilizes the premise all the way through visually, dramatically, and comedically, connecting these two characters. And I do love ultimately how that crystallizes, especially with Wade and Ember coming from polar opposite extremes. And again, forgiving the obviousness of the metaphor,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
execution, I do find it pretty striking. Part of it is the animation itself, which I do think is sharp and deft.
I
and
really like
vivid.
the animation here. It's
Yeah.
it's more interesting. You know, there's almost like a two-dimensional element to it at times with regard to some of the character designs, especially between
Yeah.
the fire people.
Mhm.
It almost looks like paper mache or origami or something like that, which is
Yeah.
I don't know if that was intentional, but it's different. It's not what you would expect from Pixar.
I agree. And I what I love about the animation is, and it's not just the colorization of it or the cleverness of it. And I do think the film takes advantage of its premise visually, comedically, and dramatically to have some fun, to create irony, create tension at times. And because we're talking about water and fire, there's this incessant, I don't want to say dread, but perhaps trepidation as
There's a
for
danger
how these
there.
characters
Yeah.
can, because they don't know. Like, there's an uncertainty there. And in the context of this film and what it means for these characters physically, there's, again, there's some fun to be had there. There's some, intensity to be had there at times in this film.
Sure.
But what that means thematically, and the fear that's involved there, I think there's a lot that you can mine out of that. And what with what you're talking about with Peter Sohn and how personal this is for him. I like how he's able to tap into the animation, give it texture, again, not just for what we're seeing visually, but what it means on an emotional scale.
Yeah.
And to me, that is really good. And, when you consider, Leia Lewis and her vocal performance here as Ember, and she is
she's
our
great.
central figure. We see everything through her eyes in this film. And it's not only her wittiness and this self-confidence, but also how that deconstructs when she's interacting with her father, because she just wants to make him proud and she's constantly failing. But, she's also wanting to pursue this at all costs. And to the point where she's making a lot of mistakes. And I think that comes through quite potently in her performance. Now, Mamadou Ache, it sounds like I certainly like him more than you. However, I do understand where you're coming from, because his performance, and I mentioned this in my video review, like, it's over the top. Like, it's kind of wonderfully over the top for me.
Yeah. And this is what I'm wrestling with, because the character that he's playing, or I should say, the people he is representing as water, we sometimes refer to them as sadness because we see them as tears, and that joke is in the movie. So the fact that he is so obnoxiously positive might be the point. But I think there is a line that you can cross where it starts to work against itself. And that's where I think it falls into, unfortunately.
Yeah. And my best guess, I haven't really heard Peter Sohn talk about this or Mamadou Ache, but I kind of wonder if the thought process was, well, we're working within an allegory that most kids probably won't be able to process or understand.
Yeah.
Where can we meet them in this film? Well, let's have these characters be so goofy at times and funny that that's where we can bring in a younger audience. And I have a little bit of personal perspective there, because I went to the press screening for this with my son Sam, who is
I was going to ask you about that, because I know you brought Sam with you.
Yeah, and given everything else that I've seen with him recently, which includes Indiana Jones and The Flash and Transformers, and God knows what else, Spider-Man, the sequel. This was one of the least engaging movies for him.
Okay.
But where he did engage was with that silly goofiness at times. Like, that's something that he was able to wrap his mind around. And I have seen some criticisms chalked to this film in that regard, and how it's, maybe comparatively to other Pixar films,
it's a little inconsistent, I think, because of that. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing I want to try and get away from and make sure we're not saying, or at least from my perspective, since I like the film a little bit less than you, I'm not saying that I think the film is quote unquote mediocre, because if it wasn't for that reservation I have, I would probably be pretty darn close to you as far as how I feel about the film. Like, I think there is this tendency to confuse Pixar movies that are lesser so as being mediocre when they're simply just more mild, if that makes sense. Yeah. Because a movie like Luca and even Turning Red, I think sometimes they had some of those similar reservations from people. And just because they weren't as elaborate or as calculated as, let's say, a recent effort like Soul, for instance, which is a movie I actually think falls apart a little bit because of how methodical it is. But here, like, I actually love the simplicity of this one. I like that Pixar is taking a step back to focus on simplicity. And I like the more mild offerings, and that doesn't make the film mediocre. It's just, there's that one component that's kind of frustrating for me.
And look, that is fair. Again, I did like the goofy playfulness of it. And there's something,
the idea, but yeah,
and there's something about the Ripple family and how easily invoked they are through, sentimentality, as saccharine as it is at times, and how that just draws out these instant tears. Like, and maybe it's because I wear my emotions on my sleeve all the time. I would fit in with the Ripple family so seamlessly. Like that, those are my people, right?
It's interesting, because I like the family dynamic of the Ripple family. I like that. Really, it was just Wade. It was only Wade that kind of stuck out like a sore thumb for me, even though they are still carrying some of the similar optimistic annoyances. But again, this is why I think maybe it's on Achi's performance and that he just crossed the line a little bit too heavily into that youthful, goofy mentality. And maybe that was also kind of the point too, because Wade doesn't have nearly as much of an arc here as Ember does, and that's not really a criticism. I don't mind that because this is Ember's story as we're talking about. But I feel like the overtly optimistic vibe that Wade gives off, it's almost like it's trying to leave room for this question as to whether he might be too optimistic, that it's almost kind of a character flaw. And maybe that's what it's going for. And I felt like at times it was, but sometimes it's just so brazenly optimistic that it just felt like this character is here just to help Ember get to her point. And it started to make him feel more like a MacGuffin at times. I just wish the dynamic was better then. It sounds like a lot of people out there really did respond to the romance at least. And I might be in the minority there. But it's something I do wish I felt more going into this.
I did feel the lushness of the romance, and some of that is Ache's performance, some of it is the writing and how it's working together, and some of it is simply the allegory, Ember and her dynamic with her father, this failure that she's feeling, but then when she meets Wade, she's starting to find a little bit more about herself, and that discovery I think comes through so well in Leia Lewis' performance that, you know, when her dynamic with Wade comes along, I never found it too distracting in that regard. And I think Ache, in addition to his playfulness, which, as I've stated, it sounds like I certainly like it a little bit more than you. But in terms of the sincerity of the character, because when he reverts against the playfulness and it becomes about that romance, and he does bring a sincerity to the character that I do think
I didn't mind those moments.
Charming.
Yeah, when it quiets down a little bit, I think there is a tenderness there that mostly works.
Yeah, and so I really liked how all of that comes together. Where I have a little bit of an issue with the film comes down to the plotting of the film. Overall, I like the writing, but the plotting I have an issue with because it contrives drama that I don't think is wholly necessary. And when
the whole shutting down of the restaurant subplot, or not the restaurant, but the store,
and thinking about the flooding aspect of the film and all of that's kind of thrown in there. Additionally to what you're saying, like that element,
they tie in together. They're essentially part of the same subplot.
Absolutely. And I wish I could remember who brought this up, but I was in a conversation with someone on Twitter, I believe, or maybe it was in our In Session Film Facebook group. I'm blanking, so forgive me. But I was in a conversation with someone who said something along the effects, the reason he didn't respond to this film is because it doesn't establish any rules, and therefore it doesn't abide by any rules. It just kind of goes. Which I kind of love.
Oh, I like that too. Yeah.
And this speaks to the simplicity that you were talking about, because with something like Soul, that film has these, high concept rules that it tries to abide by that I think it falters under midway through that film. That
movie is so frustrating.
It is.
That's a movie that is all about, it has so many rules. It's so composed, but jazz music is all about improvisation and looseness. So the rules contradict the whole I'm sorry, I'm getting away from this. The movie frustrates me.
And you're right. I'm frustrated too. Or even something like my beloved Inside Out. Right here for those watching on the V.
That does it well. That does it right.
That film has a lot of complexities to it, but I think does it so profoundly. It is excellent. That is animation at its most striking. It has a little bit of a high level concept to it, like the psychological nuances that they're able to visualize in such an accessible way is just mind blowing to me, and it's so incredibly emotional as well. Like everything comes together so fluidly there.
You notice how Pete Docter's films that he has directed for Pixar has kind of gone through like this dip in basically, like, it started with Monsters Inc., which was really all about the emotion, and then Up comes around. There's a little more cleverness to it, so it's slightly uneven. Inside Out's like this perfect merriment, okay, between the clever world building, the psychology of it, and then Soul is the literal opposite of like it's literally like it's completely going through a curve as far as what like attribute it's favoring, and and I think Soul certainly suffers from it.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring all of that up to say this: when we consider Elemental City, it could have easily have gotten bogged down in the world building of. We have the fire residents, the water residents, air, the earthly residents, and this is how everything functions in this city. And here's how how everyone interacts, and it spends a lot of time on the world building, and it really doesn't. This film, to your point earlier, is actually way more simple than that. It avoids those traps within Soul that Soul does fall under. That I agree with you with. This film avoids that because it doesn't really get into it at all. Like the little bit of world building we see mostly comes through visually and how they depict Elemental City. And through the flooding, I guess, we're able to see visually what's at stake. But the film doesn't directly get into it. We don't get any sort of background information. There's no exposition on it all. This film is wholly focused on its allegories as it relates to its immigrant settings and this romance that Ember gets into with Wade and how those things collide here. How her relationship with Wade ultimately helps form her identity in a way that creates conflict as it relates to her father in this store that she is supposed to be taking over. That's what this movie is, and it's the film doesn't need to establish any rules because it doesn't care about rules. I love that about this film.
I agree with you. Now, I think it was which critic was it? I think it was Alonzo Duralde from Breakfast All Day who made a pretty funny joke about the rules here in the form of a question, which is like, these fire people who come here, they have to keep themselves fueled by eating logs, right? And sticks. So does that mean they're eating earth people? It's like so. It's that's a little minor thing. I'm not going to hold the movie accountable for small things like that, but it is fun to think about those things. I will say, while I do love the simplicity of the film that we're talking about, I do kind of wish we at least saw a little bit more of Element City. At times, it feels like it's very much a backdrop, and I think it just would have been kind of fun to see, not necessarily the rules of how it works and operates, but just from a visual standpoint,
experience it a little bit more.
Yeah. The city itself just feels like a backdrop, and I think it could have been at least part of the reason why I think I would have liked to see more of it is to just have a bit more of a loose adventure that these two characters go on, rather than rely on this conflict that then comes up with regard to the flooding and the eventual potential closing of this store, because then all of a sudden I'm starting to sense the Pixar formula a little bit, like some type of goal that you need to achieve between two very different types of characters, right? It's usually an oddball pairing, right? An odd couple of sorts. That's usually what they do. But when there's a goal like that in mind, you start to kind of recognize the formula a little bit more, which is what I loved about Luca. Luca has a similar oddball pairing of sorts, at least two very different characters with different mentalities. But the goal was so simple. They just wanted to spend the summer together and ride a scooter. Like, that's the movie. That's the movie. So then you find yourself realizing how the movie's getting a little bit further away from the formula. And I think there's a moment that this could have done that if it maybe kind of got away from some of that plotting you're talking about.
Well, and I wanted to bring that up because that is ultimately what keeps this from being in that first tier with Luca and with Inside Out. Now, it's not enough that it's a huge detriment, but given the simplicity and focus of this film, and yes, perhaps it would have been enlightening to see a little bit more of the city and how everyone interacts. But ultimately, I love its focus that it is about Ember, this store, what the store means to her father, why she's so dedicated to take over it as a result of that, and where he comes from. And we learn a little bit of his background and the relationship he had with his father and how that connects with Amber, which is all very moving in the end.
Yeah.
And that is the major emphasis of this film. So I don't want to say that like the plotting of this film is a major detriment, because I don't think it is.
No.
And I do think that Wade, as I mentioned earlier, how he kind of helps heighten Ember as she's on that journey of finding her own identity. I love how the screenplay maneuvers those dynamics. However, you know, the reason I wanted to bring up the rules was, for one, I love that the film doesn't really care to establish it for all the reasons I mentioned.
Right.
However, what's my issue with the plotting is that it's almost as if the screenplay is remembering that, hey, we haven't established any rules. We're not playing by any rules, but with the plotting, maybe we should. and so with this
it can't
subplot,
quite have its cake and eat it.
It can't, and that's where it kind of succumbs to the idea of is setting these rules or boundaries. Like, emotionally speaking, the film doesn't care to have any exposition. It just kind of gets into its thing. Elemental City is what it is. You see it visually. And I do think that we get to experience it a little bit with that little sporting event scene, or there's the hot air balloon moment, or the underwater moment as she's seeing this flower and whatnot. Like, so we do get to experience it a little bit, but never at the cost of Ember and her identity and how that's evolving as it relates to Wade and her father. But the subplot that takes place throughout the film, one with, you know, the changing of the name of the store, and also the overflowing of water and the potential flooding. That is where the film succumbs to not having any rules, like, because it is at that point pandering to the rules that it never established. And I think that's ultimately where the film does, you know, because at that point, like, not only is it succumbing to the rules that's not there, that's one part of it. The other part is it's almost as if it doesn't believe that the romance and the allegory cannot carry the drama of the film. Like, as if there's not enough
that's kind of a good
weight
point.
there.
It doesn't quite trust the romance. It almost seems like
it's like, you know, because I think of that moment, and I'll be vague here because I don't want to give away spoilers, but there's this really tender moment between Wade and Ember at one point where they finally realize the potential of who they could be together. And immediately following that is this moment where, we can't have this because we got a contrived drama. And, you know,
can't have this because movie.
Because of movie. And look, I understand that movies got to get us from A to B to C, but the inherent organic tension that is there as a result of Ember wrestling with her identity as it relates to her father and Wade. There's so much there that you don't have to contrive drama. Just use the natural rhythms of what that progression could look like. And when this film does that, it is borderline top tier. It is very good, but then it kind of stumbles over itself to go, I don't know if that's going to work. Let's make this a little bit more bombastic. And like,
it's kind of twofold too, because where that bombacity ends up going in its final minutes, really, it actually works. Like, I think a lot of the character dynamics and what they're going through in those final moments, I think, are very tender, especially between Ember and her father, Bernie.
Yeah.
I think I love the father-daughter relationship here. That whole dynamic, I wish at some points I wish that was the movie, but I understand that it's not really the same allegory at work if it isn't that own. It needs the romance to actually justify the allegory that Peter Sohn is going for, right? The embracing of differences that quote unquote do not mix, right? But the dynamic between Ember and Bernie is amazing. It's and I love it because it is simple. It's not overthought. It's not overly complicated. I'd say 90% of audiences can relate to it in some way. And I love that about it.
Even without the immigrant component, I think a lot of us can certainly relate with wanting to connect with our parents in some sort of way. But as we begin to form our own path forward, our own identities, it's not always in alignment with your parents. And yet you still are able to find middle ground. Like, you're still able to maintain that tender relationship between a parent and a child, and given what we learn about Ember's grandfather, I guess, her
Yeah.
father's father,
Yeah.
like with where all of that goes and how Wade brings something to it in that regard, and what we see in that final moment. I mean, if you're not moved by that, you have no soul. That's the only
Or
way
maybe
I
you
can
have no parents
articulate.
anymore. For so it's
Yeah, I'm being facetious, but I
yeah.
think it is very moving. Yeah, I think it's affecting.
I agree. I agree. I mean, I guess like the only real separator that makes them unique is, I mean, because I guess none of us here, JD, know how to speak the language of Firish. So
That's true.
I will say that is the
true.
funniest joke in the movie. The fact that their
Yeah.
language is called Firish.
Fire it. Yeah, no, it's
that is good.
Yeah, it's great. No, and yeah, so I do love all of that. And look, as much as I articulate the plotting of the film, specifically the subplotting of the film, and how I think that stumbles on itself and is almost counterintuitive to where the true weight of this film lies in terms of the romance and its allegory.
Yeah.
That is ultimately a small part of this movie, which is why I still think quite easily this is like in that second tier of Pixar. You know, it is a far cry from the likes of Finding Dory and Cars 2 and Lightyear. It's not Inside Out.
Definitely, it's better than those. And while I often criticize a movie like Soul, for instance, which is a movie I think is way more frustrating than this, I think I still slightly prefer Soul over this one, just because I like the subject matter of that one and the musicality of that. So the vibe of that movie. But I think Elemental is a better movie as far as a narrative construction goes.
Yes.
So you're right. It is certainly better than the likes of Cars 2 and in my opinion, Lightyear and Onward and Monsters University. Like the whole joke out there that it's elemental is, I mean,
very tired and mundane.
Well, it's so
inventive.
obvious. I mean, if you feel that way about the movie, that's great. But I mean, I can guarantee at least 500 people out there think they came up with that joke. I mean, that's just the thing.
So, you know, looking at the lineup since Toy Story 3.
Mm-hmm.
There's Inside Out and Luca. Those two are clearly on a different stratosphere.
Yes. I'm going to back it up and say, Luca is right now, of the 27 Pixar films. I'm looking at my ranking now on Letterboxd. I have Luca at number 4, just behind Ratatouille, WALL-E, and Up.
I love it as well. I don't have my rankings in front of me, but I think I have that in my top 5. And Inside Out is my number 1.
That's your number 1. Yep.
So of the films since Toy Story 3, I honestly might have this at number 4. I like it that much.
Yeah, let's see, because you have Luca, Inside Out. Those are definitely the top 2 for me as well. Turning Red would be...
2.
Oh, Incredibles 2 is my number 3. Number 4 would be Turning Red for me.
Yeah, and this would be my number 4.
I actually think I'd put Coco at my number 5, now that I think about it. I like Coco. I think that one does succumb to the Pixar formula a little bit, and I think the villainous reveal in the third act is a little contrived, but again, I like Soul. I kind of like the musicality of that one.
Yeah, no, Coco I really like. I feel like its contrivances are slightly more frustrating for me there than they are with Elemental.
Because they feel more... not inconsequential, that's not the right word, but they feel more unnecessary. Like they didn't need to go that route.
But like Elemental, Turning Red, and Coco are actually great examples of what I'm talking about. Like those are like solidly in that second tier of this.
They're good movies. They're good animated movies. Yeah.
Yeah, like those are good. Soul is kind of ish getting there.
So the thing about Soul is that Soul is... I think that is both one of Pixar's best and worst at the exact same time. Sometimes in the exact same scene. Like it's kind of interesting. I mean, actually, like the whole body swap angle of Soul is really that film's biggest problem.
I do not like that at all.
Terrible. Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah. And I think it trips on itself a little bit in that third act, but I mean you are right though. Like the musicality, there's like the visual nature of that film is kind of fascinating at times. If I'm going to create like a third tier, I guess Soul and Toy Story 4 would be there. And then there's the bottom tier, which
we don't need to talk about. We don't need to talk about those.
Yeah.
And this is not to knock Elemental for being maybe less vibey as some of those other films, or it doesn't have as many aesthetic goodness as those other movies, because we didn't even talk about the score here. And this is, it's
Yeah.
kind of nice to see Thomas Newman return to a Pixar film. We haven't seen his
Yeah.
name tied to one in a while. And
Mhm.
I do think the musicality here is good. There's a couple original songs here I think that are also really good too. So
I
it's,
agree.
yeah, maybe it sometimes falls a bit more into that Walt Disney Animation Studios vibe a little bit. And maybe this is why it didn't get into the rules of Element City, because it may have run the risk of being compared to Zootopia a little bit.
Sure.
And I think it kind of gets close, especially aesthetically speaking. So it kind of avoids
Yeah.
that by just putting the city in the backdrop and never really talking about it.
That's true. Zootopia gets into that a lot more than
Yeah,
Elemental
it
does.
does. Yeah.
So like, yeah, I mean, I love that about Elemental. I love that it doesn't establish rules because primarily it's emphasizing that romance and allegory. And so this film doesn't need those rules, which is
Yeah.
why it is baffling that at times the screenplay's like, well, maybe. Like maybe, like, but it's too late. Like you can't do that
Yeah.
now. Like,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
like, it's
As
a
we're
slight
talking
thing.
here, as we're talking here, I know we're kind of doing this real time, so I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole, but I am slightly updating my ranking as we're talking about this.
Okay.
I am putting Elemental up at least 1 or 2 notches after this conversation, because
Okay, good.
originally I did have it behind Toy Story 4. But then I remembered Toy Story 4 has what I like to dub inner voice Buzz Lightyear, which I think is the worst thing Pixar has ever done, and that's including Cars 2 and 3.
Yeah.
So I have to put it ahead of Toy Story 4 right now.
Like
Okay.
I don't know what to make of Toy Story 4. I think in a microcosm with no context whatsoever, it's mostly a good movie.
I like
But
Forky, and I like some of the
yeah,
the existentialisms that it gets into about toy life and toy living, which I think is kind of
yeah.
interesting. But
I just on the whole, it is, especially thematically, it is so redundant, and
it kind of
I
is.
find it so kind of banal as a result. Like the
Yeah.
new things they add into it are compelling, which is again why it's not a bad movie. It is good.
Yeah.
It to me adds nothing to that franchise.
I'm kind of
So
with you.
I don't know where to put it really.
Yeah.
So
I have it around 18 out of the 27, so it's not one
yeah,
of my
that's
favorites.
probably where I'd have it as well.
Yeah, there's
At
still
any
more good
rate,
things in it than some of these other ones.
final thoughts, Elemental. Do you have any final thoughts here?
I am willing to give this film a second try because, like I said, really my biggest reservation, although I do agree with you on some of the plotting and some of the need to add some drama and conflict that maybe it didn't necessarily warrant, but really my biggest reservation is around the Wade character and just how abrasively optimistic that he is, that it kind of came off like a bit of a roadblock to me when it
Mhm.
came to the romance. But if I'm able to give the film a second go with that knowledge in mind and I'm able to come around on the romance, then this is one of those movies that does rise kind of significantly.
Yeah,
It really is that one major component that I'm really wrestling with.
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe I'm just the one out of my element a little bit on this. Maybe I just need to be in the right headspace for it. So I guess
Yeah.
to be continued, but right now I think it's good. I'm just not in love with it like I want
Fair.
it to be.
No, that's fair, and I'd be curious to hear what a rewatch does for you in that regard.
Yeah.
And like I said, I really like this film. It really is just the subplotting of this film that I think kind of keeps it in that second tier from being really great. But yeah, I mean, I kind of love what this film is aiming for, even if it is perhaps derivative. That's a criticism that I don't wholly subscribe to at times. I think that is an apt description for a movie, but
Sure.
here, when you're talking about what this film is doing as an allegory and as a romance, man, in execution, I think it's really good. It is so sincere. It has a lot of heart. And as I was talking about earlier, that's what makes Pixar what they are. It is all about the heart of their movies and the compelling characters that they're able to render. And I love how this film gives us the facade of something high concept like an Inside Out or a Soul, and then completely subverts that by just
Sure.
being a simple allegory in romance.
Yeah.
That's all that it is.
Yeah.
And I think it's mostly effective as those things. And I'll agree with you about the score. I'm very anxious to go and listen to it on its own outside of the context of the film, but in the theater, I did enjoy it. And
Yeah,
like you
same.
said, good to have Thomas Newman back. So,
Absolutely.
all right. Well, that's it. We have a written review of this on the website that you can go and check out at InSessionFilm.com.
Yep.
And as I noted earlier, I have a video review of this up. That's something that we're doing as of recently as well. We're going to have more video reviews, which are much more shortened than this and more concise. So we'll have more of those coming on the way. I'm hoping to record one for Indiana Jones this week. So hopefully we'll get that up soon. And maybe if I can talk Brennan into doing one or two, I'll get his butt up there as well.
Let me get married first. I have other priorities
first. Fair. That's understandable. At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Inside Out and Luca, top tier Pixar.
Donnie, you're out of your element.